My name is Wright. I am the voice of reason. I speak for the Last Crusade.
Our society is deeply corrupt beyond any human power to cure. The question to be answered is how we have come to this pass, where the enemies are placed, and what strategies it is prudent to employ in opposition. The balm of sweet reason has lured some of the undecided into the camp of the Last Crusade, that last stand of Western civilization against barbarians without the gate and quislings within. But the quislings themselves have lost the gift of speech, and the barbarians with scorn reject it. The time for speech ended when arsonists and rioters were aided and abetted by elected officials of the Democrat Party. The enemy has entirely corrupted that party. Any virtue or dignity they once possessed is long gone. They can no longer be reasoned with. They will no longer abide by the outcome of elections. Armed force alone will cow them. They are tools and fools of the foe, but they are not the foe. They are our brethren, children of the same loving Creator as are we all. Who is the foe? We fight against principalities and powers, thrones, dominations, and archons of a spiritual darkness. To be sure, there are those who serve knowingly. Rumors of black Sabbaths, spirit feasts, and pederasty ring among the rich and powerful, and have a disturbing ring of truth to them, the iron clang of Lilith and Asmodeus and Moloch. The greater number, like the Eloi who are eaten by the Morlocks, serve in partial or total ignorance, idiotically deceived. So do not blame the wolf cub for loving the bitch who bore and nursed him. He has never known otherwise. But neither, now that he is grown, let us spare him when he savages the sheep. I do not counsel mercy for an enemy who will not retreat and will not surrender. Let your sword be swift and heavy in your hand. I mean only that we must pray for the fallen and give them burials with all due dignity and decorum. And let us also care for their widows and orphans as a work of mercy, and pray that the next generation might be less stony-hearted to receive the good seed of the gospel. How did we come to this pass? We have been subjected for over a century to the lures, temptations, lies, and flattering sense of overweening pride, all nourishing the evil, poisonous orchids of dishonor, dishonesty, perversion, and violence. We have been lured into the politics of anarchy, the economics of cannibalism, and the glorification of the aberrant. For over 100 years we have suffered a war of the abnormal against the normal, and so far the abnormal has prevailed without loss. The enemy is a destructive and self-destructive force which rebels against both Creator and creation. By rejecting God, the enemy rejects any power higher than the human will to determine virtue, truth, and beauty. The concept of evolution, or progress, and the ever-changing standards replaces a concept of objectivity. Truth becomes relative, hence not truth. Virtue becomes virtue signaling. Beauty is banished. In a godless world, men are merely uppity animals, locked in a Darwinian struggle of all against all, a war without sense, pity, honor, or quarter. Humanity is merely the atavism fated to be swept aside by the goose step of history, ever advancing toward the promised high-soaring adamantine minarets of Nietzschean supermen, which would prove to be, were they real, merely the abattoirs, dungeons, and pits of the Morlocks. In a godless world, there is no law above human law, no truth above human opinion, and no rules of reason. Moral qualms are a sign of weakness. In such a ghastly, airless, monochromatic lunar landscape of desolation, with neither laws nor justice, truth nor reason, civilization nor chivalry, the only reality is power. The power to enslave body and mind, and to compel the unwilling, to laud and glorify known and absurd falsehoods. When the corruption is complete, the cowering and wretched of the world will voluntarily seek out the tyranny of total conformity, the intrusion of the thought police, and the Orwellian doublethink of newspeak, without any need to compel them. There is no point in pointing out the hypocrisy of souls, to whom hypocrisy is the source and summit of all they crave and seek. One cannot wake up a man pretending to be asleep. But the unwary can be warned, and the disheartened inspired, of the danger the sleepwalkers pose. What is the enemy's strength? There are 7 strongholds where the enemy has won undisputed control. Each was corrupted step by step over the space of generations, sometimes openly and rapidly, sometimes covertly and slowly. The 7 strongholds are the press, the cinema, City Hall, the marketplace, the academy, the salon, and the church. They have fallen into enemy hands, usually without a struggle, usually without any objection. The astonishing degree of their successive victories can be explained not by any political, social, or economic insight, but by a simple theological truth any child from Sunday school should know. Each of these 7 has a traitorous voice, lovely as one of the sirens of myth, living in all of our hearts, tempting us to tear down our colors, trample the cross, and lift up instead the black banner of the great anarchist, that fell spirit who scorns the laws of earth and heaven alike. These are the voices of the 7 deadly sins. For each of these 7 strongholds or seats of enemy power, let us say which of the besetting sins tempted us to surrender the citadel, which now flies a flag over each. That is not to say there were not a myriad of weaknesses involved, a long and complex sequence of social degeneration in each case. But certain deadly sins, like the unmistakable returning theme or leitmotif in an opera, form a persistent and particular character of corruption, which is visible in this generation as each grows monstrous through long and unopposed domination. Press. In America, in the current generation, the press is the source of news and literal facts about the world. This includes newspapers, magazines, cable and broadcast television, corporations, podcasts, nearly everything, aside from AM talk radio. Even on talk radio stations, the hourly news headlines follow the talking points established by the press, and repeat their falsehoods uncritically. Some opposition news is honest, some merely gelded or controlled opposition. In my youth, some 100 or so corporations controlled the major media companies of the time. Now it is less than 10. All the tines of the rake come from one handle. The competition for readership in a healthy press industry would serve as a check on corruption. But when all public choirs sing from the same sheet music, there is no such check. The scope and extent of corruption cannot be overstated. The reckless insolence of the falsehoods being spread, the appalling gullibility of the unwary, if not willing victims, the reach and penetration of the mob psychology tactics being used is without precedent in human history. The information control in the Soviet Union was not so deep, so broad, and so entirely divorced from sanity as this. The Soviets claimed that their feats were victories and their poverty was wealth. But they never made it a thought crime to say that men were not women. The press is wrath. While the phenomenon of the total and complete abandonment, first of journalistic standards and then later of honesty and sanity, had been rightly called Trump derangement syndrome during the past few years, please note that the same grinding enmity was present directed against Bush, Reagan, and Nixon. The same enmity is found in the writings of Mao and Marx. As Mr. Trump correctly said, the fake news does not hate him. They hate you, and he is merely standing in their way. And ultimately, they do not even really hate us. What threat do any of us pose to titanic media empires? They hate him in whose name we serve. The press merely seeks power through lies. The cinema. The cinema is the source of our shared imagination, the visual and theatrical. This includes the production of Hollywood motion picture industry, and also television franchises, theme parks, and comic book companies that the industry owns or influences. The corruption here is likewise spread widely and penetrates deeply, to the point where not a single major pop culture franchise or beloved character has not been marred, belittled, or ruined. Motion picture classics like Gone with the Wind are censored, or come with warning labels, and franchises such as the James Bond films, Star Wars, Star Trek, Doctor Who, Ghostbusters, The Terminator, The Predator, Charlie's Angels have all been degraded into a malign and malodorous dumpster fire of ineffective and ugly progressive political propaganda. The cinema is lust. The allure of the beautiful people, with all their glamour and sex appeal, twisted the wholesome romanticism of the post-war generation and the sweet sentimentality of the Victorian age into the proposition that chastity was slavery, family life despicable, and therefore sexual liberation, as the various forms of fornication, adultery, and sexual perversion were then called, was the fountainhead of liberty and power. The entertainment industry promises that through unchastity to women and men alike, power may be obtained. City Hall. In America, in the current generation, City Hall, or political power, is vested almost exclusively in an unelected federal bureaucracy, only indirectly controlled by White House and Congress. State and local governments have been losing power and influence for decades, and the whole course of the modern age since roughly World War I, if not since the Civil War, has been to reduce or remove the ability of voters to say under what laws we shall be governed. Of the enemy strongholds, City Hall, despite the old saying, is the easiest to fight and the most open to change. It is the only source of what is often called hard power, that is, coercion in the name of the law by the ministers of the law. All other enemy strongholds are soft power, that is, positions of influence meant to allure, persuade, to gull and lull. Be not deceived, political power is the final goal. The other strongholds of influence and indoctrination are merely meant to soften and bewilder the people, to confound their minds and benumb their consciences, in order to make political revolution feasible. No matter what they say, the enemies of the enemy do not want political power for any lesser goal, or to enact any rational policy, or to change any law. They want revenge. They want blood. They want towns to burn. This pronouncement will no doubt strike many a reader as an absurd exaggeration, but then count the number of dead in the recent riots, which to date not one national politician of the Democrat Party has denounced, and not one of their creatures occupying the chairs of news editors and television anchors have condemned. Not one. When the so-called liberal gains final and unchecked political power, he becomes a leftist. All soft words end, and they become bloodthirsty, ravening beasts, killing the innocent in endless paroxysms of hellish malignancy, starting as ever with the priests. See the 20th century for details. City Hall is envy. Since before the Great War, no serious political philosophy arose to challenge the English Enlightenment principles of equality, of the natural rights of man, and of the legitimacy of government by popular mandate curtailed by limited government. The sole opposition sprang from a perversion of the idea of equality, so that, whatever man found necessary, useful, or convenient to his well-being, he claimed to have a right to it, and hence have the authority to use force to get it. Hence, all motions of the progressive era onward were born of and fed on envy. Newly discovered rights to privacy, and the emanations of their penumbra, authorized new intrusions by the state into the public sphere, murdering the concept of limits to government. The apotheosis of credentialed experts vitiates the concept of a public mandate. The right not to be harmed mutated into a right not to be offended, becoming a right not to be contradicted, which is now a right to silence others, which abolishes all natural rights at one blow by abolishing the concept. The marketplace. The marketplace, or economic influence, is centered on an organization of international banks, Wall Street trading companies, and the Federal Reserve Board, all given shape and direction from international trade agreements and non-governmental organizations. Large corporations are now large enough, and more to the point, well-connected enough, to ensure income from sources less hectic and less subject to change than consumer demand. A company propped up by government support, protected by government regulation, or patronized by well-funded allies overseas need not concern itself with the sentiments of customers at home. Offending 1 million Americans means nothing to a shoe company with 100 million Chinese customers. The adoption, usually through the personnel office, of political pieties and concerning diversity hires, of course, benefit well-established firms, and laws and lawsuits surrounding the Alice in Wonderland non-quota quotas hinder only the newer, leaner, and more competitive firms, which have no margin of error, and so must hire on merit and on merit alone. The marketplace is greed. We were promised wealth in abundance if only the banks and state, working together with no gold standard to restrict them, would by wise stewardship prevent all future recessions and depressions. We believed that the natural competition for markets between corporations would make them subservient to the will of the consumers, and in political matters, hoping for patrons from all walks of life, the business community would stay neutral. All these promises and hopes have proven false, and the mere opposite has instead occurred. Meanwhile, ironic as it seems, there are clear and sound reasons for large multinationals to support radical and left-wing causes and fund the very organizations publicly calling for the looting of the rich and the end of capitalism. For capitalism actually means competition, which is the last thing a monopolist wants. The Academy. The Academy is both the transmission of our culture to the next generation and the seat of our civilization's profound intellectual life, including the scientific community. Both higher and lower educational institutions educate about as well as cinema entertains, which is to say, not at all. As for the scientific community, the shameful cooperation by the so-called academic and scientific professionals in the ongoing global warming hoax shows the inability of this thoroughly politicized community to police itself or to correct itself. In the same way that the press has no competition for readership and hence no check on its ghastly descent into a perfectly conformist propaganda tool, likewise the academics have no competition for prestige. Research funding and public school dollars are controlled by the state. This monopoly has successfully silenced academic freedom and imposed an Orwellian uniformity on thought and speech. The academy is gluttony. They eat tax dollars in the form of student loan guarantees, direct aid, and research grants. The ability of alumni sponsors to influence social policy is minimal, and most large philanthropical education foundations are firmly controlled by the enemy and can merely outspend and outbribe any private citizen seeking to influence the curriculum. Primary education was designed to be a trap by the socialist utopians of the turn of the last century, luring parents into putting their children into the hands of government officers rather than, for example, nuns. The teachers' union prevents any attempt at reform or improvement. The academic world exists to eat our wealth and to eat the souls of our youth. The Salon. The Salon is what we might call the seat of the intellectuals. It also is called the intelligentsia, or the chattering class, of which this speaker is a proud member. The intellectual is also the amateur counterpart of the professional academic. The intellectual invents no new ideas, discovers no new truths. His role is to popularize, explain, advertise, and glorify what deeper thinkers of present or past have invented or discovered. The intellectual overlaps with the entertainer to some degree whenever he pens a detective novel or a fairy story, such as a Father Brown mystery or a Narnia novel, and he uses art, in that case, to illuminate a point of philosophy or theology and bring it to the public eye. He overlaps with the press when it comes to editorial pages, but his role is different. The academic is charged with carrying over the intellectual part of the culture, history and philosophy, the story of who and what our people are and whence we came, to the next generation. The intellectual's role is not to instruct, but to remind the general public of the shared things of our culture, the beauties we all adore, the virtues to which our ancestors' example calls us to emulate, and the truths we hold to be self-evident. The radical intellectual does the opposite of this role. He is, in fact, an anti-intellectual. He glorifies the ugly, he falsifies the past, he encourages and lauds vice and sin, and he strangles truth in the glib serpentine coils of rhetoric, sophistry, glamour, and Orwellian jargon. Each time a mass of men can be convinced to adopt false-to-facts verbalizations, the radical has successfully perverted his own role. When the normal things are called by abnormal names, such as when love and romance are called cisgendered heteropatriarchy, or when abnormal things are called by euphemisms, or called by words having the exact opposite of their true meaning, as when sodomites are called gay, or their unnatural unions are called marriage, then the anti-intellectual triumphs, and the honest intellectual has failed. Because it is the intellectual's role to maintain the intellectual consensus of the tradition, the radical intellectual is always in the false position of claiming that his innovations are somehow the true version of the consensus of opinion, or somehow the correct interpretation of ancient legacies. The example just mentioned of gay marriage was explicitly propounded by the Supreme Court to have been the intent of the Constitution and aligned with the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. It was said to be an application of the prime and shared principle of American life, namely that all men are created equal. This puts the radical in the intellectually bankrupt position of forever being engaged in the falsification of history and the removal of truth, logic, reason, and wisdom from public discourse. His talk is illogical. The radical seeks to form a new consensus, which is to say, a new idea. His task is to abolish tradition in the name of tradition. He must reason that reasoning is vain, and argue that argument is pointless, by saying all words are meaningless, and that truth is relative. No intellectual tradition and no consensus can be built on the foundation of denying the validity of tradition and consensus, for the same reason that anarchy cannot be the law of the land. Each generation of the radical hates and eats the prior. It is for this reason that, once the radical intellectual has done his work, and bewildered the common man into accepting old tyrants, now masked under new names, the tyrants set the radical intellectuals up against the wall first before all enemies of the state, and has them shot dead, even while they blubber and blink and confess their loyalty to the new regime. The Salon is pride. Only the pride of Lucifer could convince otherwise sane men of letters to adopt a worldview in which truth is not true, but each man is able to reinvent reality for himself, a little God greater than God Almighty. Only Lucifer could convince such men, in their smug self-satisfaction and self-righteousness, to call good evil, to call vice virtue, to call their sleepwalking woke, and in all things to call the destruction of all their intellectual faculties to be proof and point of their extraordinary intellectual superiority. The Church. The final stronghold that the enemy holds in this wretched generation, alas, is the Church, by which I include both the one true Catholic and Apostolic Church, as well as the various heretics and schismatics, Protestants and Evangelicals, the Greek Orthodox Church, the various Eastern, Russian, and Nestorian churches, and I hasten to include those Jews who take the teachings of the law and the prophets seriously enough to support and affirm the basic worldview of Christendom. Some denominations are infected more entirely and deeply than others, but no major denomination is immune. As a faithful Catholic, I dare utter no criticism of any other denomination except for my own. Our leadership is as bad as yours or worse. The uprightness and zeal of the Church of Latter-day Saints, on the other hand, I will laud in order to invite admiration and emulation. The religious thought and sentiment in America had at one time been the central and major part not only of our culture, but also of our politics, and it formed the default worldview of the American character. That is no longer the case. Indifference to religion and the contempt of spiritual things has not only become popular, upholding core religious tenets concerning chastity, monogamy, and the sacredness of human life have become unwelcome or even unlawful. It is called hate speech to quote biblical teachings on sodomy, and even the use of that word is frowned upon, even by the faithful who know sodomy to be a sin. Instead of weekly and daily fiery preaching against these grave evils, the leadership of the various denominations either say nothing or speak in favor of them. The shepherds help the wolves break into the fold. So the Church, alas, is sloth. Sloth does not mean laziness. It refers to the despair which comes from nonchalant indifference to spiritual things. It is a lack of zeal and passion, a lack of curiosity, a lack of creating spirit that makes men less than atheists. An atheist only says God does not exist. An agnostic says he doesn't know. But the Church of Laodicea says God exists, but he does not give a fig for anything God has ever said or done. It is not that he believes or disbelieves. He merely does not trouble himself about the matter at all. The Laodicean is neither hot nor cold, and so the Lord will spew him out of his mouth. That is the state of the Church in America. Such are the 7 strongholds of the foe. Such are the treasonous spirits, those deadly sins, living in me, as well as in all men, urging us to throw down our undrawn swords before the fray begins. What then is to be done? The matter requires deeper examination. In weeks to come, in the monologues following, only certain very basic principles of strategy can be listed. The specific tactics needed will change as the situation on the ground changes, year by year, and as the tactics of the enemy change. The long march of the enemy through all our institutions took generations and centuries. Our battles and wars to recapture the lost territory will be more rapid since, unlike the foe, we need not operate in the secret, nor need we march toward goals that are mutually contradictory, nor need we make use of rhetoric that disguises rather than ornaments the truth we serve. There is currently no institution and no party able to organize the long-term and large-scale crusade needed to save Christian civilization. The enemy has been adroit and expert at creating such parties and corrupting all institutions under the sun to their goal. No large, old, or prestigious institution or party of any description is willing to organize any resistance to this enemy. Ahead lies a most difficult long-term campaign, with years and generations of political, economic, and social action needing the coordination of institutions explicitly dedicated to the effort. Such institutions need to be built, or if they were once wholesome, need to be redeemed and cleansed and set in order. In the short term, it would be wise to own a firearm and learn its safe and proper use, as well as to stock on such food and gear as may be needed when public tumult cuts off power and water to certain areas. But this is not where we begin. We begin, with all things, in prayer and fasting.